My life, I was extraordinarily lucky. When I went to college, my first year of college, I signed up for a European history class. I just wanted to take European history, you know? And it was taught by an extremely smart Jamaican-born professor, Shanti Singham, who was an expert in the French Revolution and European history. And I'll tell you, you get a whole different sense of European history when you're being taught from the Caribbean. It was great. Amazing professor. I took three more courses. Had a great chance. She later became a professor of Africana Studies recently. Retired, that's what emerita means. That little word there, emeritus or emerita. Then when I went to graduate school, I also was very lucky to be able to study for a few years with Michel Rolfe Trouillot. Back in those days, we couldn't Google anybody, so I didn't know what I was getting into. So he actually called me on the phone and we were talking and I was like, oh, I was sure that he was, from Paris or something, one of those French theorist anthropologists, kind of like Claude Lévi-Strauss, the old school, Michel Rolfe Trouillot, right? And I got there, Haitian American anthropologist, and of course the Haitians. He had been to Paris because, of course, Haiti's colonized by the French, spoke great French, even assigned us some readings in French, which I couldn't do because I have no French skills. But super smart, brilliant professor. Unfortunately passed away like so many too soon. In graduate school, I was then introduced a little bit later to another brilliant winner of one of those Genius Awards, Guggenheim Fellow, Brackett Williams. Super smart, way too smart for me. I was really lucky to have, some super smart African-American Black professors. I cannot say, though, that, I try to assign Indigenous scholars when I can. Many of you were with me in intro. I assigned an article by Michael Wilcox on the indigenous peoples of the Pueblos and how their water was stolen by the Anglo farmers. This ringing a bell. Yeah, back in intro a little bit. Yeah, who is actually an indigenous archaeologist, which is a little bit unusual, but it's good to know. But as far as professors, I can't say that that's been part of me. These three professors sort of came into the academy in a sort of wave of hope that being in education and being professoring was going to be become more diverse. And I was just looking up the statistics. So it's hard to get statistics on this, but as of, say, last year, approximately 7% of college professors were Black or African American. And then if you look 10 years ago, what do you think it was 10 years ago? It's 7% now. Take a guess. John, you'll guess. About 7%. It's about the same. I mean, we want to believe it's getting better, right? We want to believe things are getting better. It's always the narrative that we have that things are getting better. But in terms of like Black professors in the academy, it's been pretty much level with at least about 10 years ago. I was trying to get from 20 or 30 years ago. Like I said, the folks that I was studying with were back in the day when there was this sort of optimism that our disciplines were going to become more diverse. And actually that, at least at the professoriate level, hasn't been true. Anyway, just wanted to put my own mentors out there. Brackett wrote an amazing book based on her fieldwork in Guyana. Stains on my name, war in my veins, Guyana and the politics of cultural struggle. So anthropologists who did interesting work in the Americas. I was reminded of it because I heard one of you, I believe, has some ties to, we know where Guyana is. South America, yeah, the top of South America, right above what is above Brazil, next to French Guyana, which is kind of close to French Guyana and Suriname. So you had three places there. One was a colony of the Dutch, one was a colony of the English, one was a colony of the French, and they all introduced plantation agriculture there. And French Guyana is actually still part of France. They vote in the French elections. They use the euro, one non-independent place of South America. Anyway. So, yes, the Academy, what it's like. So, Naya, start us off just like Hernandez starts us off. Doesn't pull any punches right at the beginning. What's her first statement? The United States is a nation of immigrants, which, I mean, we've all heard. And I understand the impulse because, as I was talking about it, maybe in the last class, a couple classes ago, oh no, it was the last class, you know, it does burn you when people are like, oh, get those El Salvadorans out. They don't belong here, because it's like, hey, wait a second. What are you doing here, bud? But she calls this an anti-Indigenous statement. Ooh, again, not pulling any punches. Why would she do that? Why would she say that calling the U.S. a nation of immigrants is an anti-Indigenous statement? Jacob. Immigration disrupted a lot of indigenous practice. That is certainly true. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's something, I guess, a little bit, tiny bit more fundamental, Mickey. That someone was there in the first place, right? So that the indigenous people were here long before this place was even called America. How did we get this name America anyway? We know that. Yeah, Liz. The Italian mapper, Amerigo Vespucci, who was, you know, kind of around, I think he and Columbus knew each other, but Columbus died before the Americas were ever named. It's an interesting little. Amerigo Vespucci became more famous in Europe for sailing down the coast of Brazil and realizing, actually, I think it was he realized he had stumbled on a whole continent. Columbus really didn't know where he was. And he was trying to sell it that he had landed in Asia, right? Or he had landed off the coast of India. That's why the Indians name got named. So, you know, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because, you know, in my child's social studies textbook from 7th grade, they're like talking about the people run across the ice bridge, and they said, these are the first Americans. And you're like, I mean, it makes it sound like they're immigrating in and running in with an American flag across Alaska or something. To me, it did. They're not the first Americans. They're just people coming, probably sailing down the coast, by the way, and then coming in. But to call them first Americans is kind of strange because there wasn't an America. That came out, that's a recent thing. And so you might also understand why some people have said, well, okay, Native American is a better term than Indians, for sure, but, you know, it still basically incorporates Amerigo Vespucci in it. Anyway, we'll try and follow as much as possible Hernandez and others in our naming practices. It gets complicated for reasons we'll see. So oh wait, we're still talking about why it's problematic to call the United States a nation of immigrants. So the first problematic part is that people were already here. So they hadn't immigrated or, you know, immigrated a long, long time ago in a whole different way. But there's other things that happened is that people didn't all choose to immigrate here. We'll go back to Anaya on this one. Who are these people immigrating into the Americas? Yeah. Enslaved Africans are not exactly immigrants, right? They didn't talk about a forced decision. It was a very forced decision. It wasn't a decision at all. So, you know, this is the kind of the true history of America. And it's something that I think people are more beginning to realize now, and she names as settler colonialism. The United States and other places in Latin America, so not just the United States, were built upon an ethic or an idea of settlement and settler colonialism, and it's something that underlies our practices for a long time. So we've talked about this already. I talked about this as we transition from Moran into Hernandez. We talked exactly about this, and so we'll keep going in case you missed that class. So the Europeans proceeded to start a mass project of deforestation. Has anybody ever taken Professor Anderson's environmental history class? Oh, good. Yeah, and how he talks about, did he talk to you about how they just chopped down all the trees in New England and then it started looking like England and that's why you could call it New England? And then they came over here and started chopping down all our trees. He tell you that? I sat in his class, and then they chopped down all these trees, and they just kept moving west, chopping down trees. I mean, it was hard work chopping down all those trees, but you know, that's how they did it. So that was a big project of deforestation. And we've already talked about this. And after you do that, setting up plantation agriculture, which was in some ways the United States, what would become the United States played a minor role in this. The big places for plantation agriculture were in the Caribbean and Brazil, where they did sugarcane. We were okay. We were up there, but those are the huge places like Guyana and the Caribbean. The systems there were enormous. For the indigenous people of the Americas, of course, they're visited with a lot of oppression and a lot of disease, which, as Liz and I discussed this morning, this was probably the first instance of global human-caused climate change, because there was so much, in the outset, there was so much population decline in the Americas, as well as the beginnings of some of this enslavement trade and stuff like that going on, that you see it was actually a drop in global temperatures because of the massive retaking of, or massive, in some instances, reforestation. And we talked about this in the transition class a week ago, about the idea that the Anthropocene, the human-influenced world, began in 1610, because that's where you see this climate change is recorded for the first time, a global climate change, which was probably caused by human activity. So once they got all this stuff underway, once all the good stuff was going on in the Americas, the deforestation, the plantation agriculture, we didn't talk about mining and all those things and extraction from indigenous communities, et cetera. Zeke, what did they want to do then? Once they were tearing all this stuff down, people realized that, whoa, wait a second, wait. We might need to do some conservation here. We might need to put the brakes on before we cut down all the trees, right? And actually, in Professor Anderson's class, he reminded us that at least in the United States, and I didn't really know this at the time, the Catskills, our region, turns out were kind of important for this idea of like you look out and it's like the mountains and what's his name, the Cooperstown guy. Oh, Fenimore Cooper, well, wrote these sort of nostalgic novels about the way things used to be, which were important to this romanticization of nature and the idea that it needed to be conserved. We better conserve it. So, Hernandez, again, not pulling too many punches here. Conservation is a Western construct, she says. It's not an indigenous thing. Tori, why do we know that?
Their native language, they don't even have a word for conservation. They have a word for like heal and save, but there's nothing for conservation that fits it in the specific definition that we use.
In many indigenous languages, I don't want to say all because there's lots of indigenous languages, many of which were forcibly extirpated, but for those that are still around, there's not a word for conservation. Tyler, what do they use instead? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we probably won't be able to, but what does it mean? Taking care of or healing. And so, again, what she's saying is, one, there wasn't a need for the word conservation because they were actively participating in their lands. They weren't destroying their lands. There's not a need to conserve something that you aren't destroying. You're actively participating in it. And the closest word that they would have is a word for care for, to take care of, or what she is trying to tell us, title of the book, subtitle of the book, healing. Which is a very, again, a participatory, hands-on kind of thing. Instead of the idea that you have to kick all the people out, you have to get rid of people, and that's the way nature conserves itself. Now you have to actually bring the people in. And it's also true that in the Americas, a lot of the landscapes, people didn't realize how much the indigenous peoples were caring for them and managing them. And so when people tried to displace them, the landscapes would get all weird. And then they're like, oh, wait a second. Oh, yeah, people were doing something cool here, and now I messed it up. Anyway. Jumping ahead a little bit, because I think, it's all sort of, I think maybe this blends together with some later stuff, which is how conservation turns out to have, oh, there it is, racism and the history of conservation. Yay. So fun. Autumn, tell us about Gentle John Muir. So you just learned the nice guy part. That's all you had. Yeah, I guess, he looks like a nice guy. out there contemplating nature. But yeah, even the Sierra Club, this was from 20. When did they do this? I forgot. 2021, maybe. So, you know, the Sierra Club, of course, was founded by or draws its inspiration from John. Yeah, he is its founder, and they have now acknowledged that this was a thing. Now, does that mean that I should give up my Sierra Club membership? I don't think I should beat up on the Sierra Club that much, especially since I'm up here at the front of the room. So, you know, I still have my Sierra Club card. But, you know, you have to acknowledge that these are the kinds of things that people that happened, and it didn't have to be that way, by the way. There were other people who had different ideas about how this should all go down. And in that century where he was, there were people who were actually defending the indigenous traditions and saying that we should actually, as Americans, embrace them instead of trying to kick everybody out. But in some sense, the idea of the national park was trying to keep certain areas as completely natural or free from human influence and make sure that only certain people had access to them. And I showed you the picture in the last class of what is called Devil's Tower in Wyoming, which was a sacred spot that then became a big climbing wall and was named badly. There's another place that was named badly. Cass, where is this? Good guess. Anybody ever been to Yellowstone? Oh, good. Zeke, what's it like? Oh, there it goes. Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to get too close to them. No, you didn't go to Devil's Tower, Wyoming. No, just Yellowstone. It is an amazing place. Yeah. Cass, what they have to do though to make Yellowstone? Yeah. Yep. Oh, the bison. So you didn't see them that close? In the tree area. Yeah, no, you're reminding me. I had to wait when in 1999. I had a Volkswagen Golf, and my wife and I went from Michigan and drove west. Went to Yellowstone, where the water goes up like this. See Old Faithful, and then on the drive from Old Faithful back to where we were staying, all these bison coming at us on this 2-lane highway. And I'm in this pretty small, the old Volkswagen Golf. We just stopped. I mean, you just stopped, and it was the weirdest thing. It's like you're looking at, you know, you're still kind of have your headlights on, and that you're not going to go anywhere. They're just coming at you, and they're just like, they just kind of went around us. But if like any one of them decided to flunk over the car, it would have been all over for us. Weirdest thing. Wish they would have stayed out there in the trees instead of walking down my road, but there they were. Anyway. Yeah, this is Yellowstone. This is actually a place that Hernandez talks about, Mount Doan, on page 96. Now, Mount Doan, as she said, was named for this leader of a massacre. Thank goodness. 2022, they changed the name of this mountain from Mount Doan to First Peoples Mountain. How nice of the national. Well, they actually consulted with the indigenous peoples of the area in order to make this name change. And I don't know if Mr. Doan's descendants are getting mad about having his name taken away from the mountain. But I looked on the National Park Service, and it did not sound like he was a great person. He did lead this massacre. And then he wrote fondly about this attack and bragged about it for the rest of his life. So don't massacre people, and if you do, don't brag about it. Yuck. All right, so anyway, gonna take away that mountain name from people like that. Anyway, it's good to, you know, a little bit of renaming there. Hernandez says that this happened not only in the United States, but what happened in the United States then became a sort of model for other parts of the world. And we could talk about wildlife reserves in Africa, for example, where similar things have happened. She uses the example of Monte Cristo National Park in El Salvador. And I looked it up, and you can travel there. This is from the El Salvador travel site for those of you who want to get down to El Salvador while the going's still good. And then you can be that person looking at the trees. I mean, it's kind of just like she says in the book, they really don't talk at all about indigenous people in the area. It's mostly about the nice trees that you can see. No bison though, but you know, you can see some good trees there. So one of the issues is that the national park model, which was established in the United States, was then exported sometimes by the same experts and people into other parts of the world. And so people would pay for the conservation of various areas by trying to remove people from those areas. Which echoes, going back, Jacob, it echoes a kind of model of research and telling people what to do, which we know of as the, yeah, what's that? Yeah, and so, you know, I think she is rightly critiquing the top-down approach of these kinds of planners and from above science. But I think it's also good to acknowledge that on page 84, so then she talks about how they came in with their fancy cameras and equipment, and she saw them, and under her breath, my grandmother whispered to me, Mija, my daughter, these are people similar to anthropologists. Oh my gosh, that's me. You know, and so what this grandmother was saying is, hey, these anthropologists once came in to take our stories and get their careers and stand up there at the front of the room. And now here come these other people to get our knowledge and all those things. Now, Hernandez is following in a kind of tradition, you might say. I think I might have mentioned this, and those of you who've had a class with me before, a kind of a famous book by Vine Deloria Jr., I think written in the 1960s or so. Custer died for your sins, an Indian manifesto. And in this book, one of the most famous, at least for anthropologists section, is a whole chapter called Anthropologists and Other Friends, which talks about how things are bad for lots of people, but Indians have been cursed above all other people in history. Indians have anthropologists to come in and take their stuff away. So, you know, it's good for me to reflect on this kind of my own disciplinary tradition as well. I don't want to just get mad at the biologists and other people around. Interestingly, Deloria's aunt was actually an anthropologist, an indigenous anthropologist who was collecting these kinds of stories. He probably saw, though, that she was unable to kind of advance her career and died pretty much penniless. So it didn't give him a very good impression of what anthropology was going to do for indigenous peoples. By the way, just a point of terminology, why would Vine Deloria use the word Indian manifesto and talk about Indians? Why does he get to do that? Or getting nervous. Vicky, go ahead. Irony. Yeah, I mean, there might be a little bit of that irony. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. He is speaks to you as he's a very witty, very smart person. You can tell from this chapter, this little excerpt, that he's wide ranging in his wittiness and irony. Actually, the anthropologist, archaeologist that I assigned to you, Wilcox, also uses for himself the term Indian, which some of us know that in most cases should only be applied to people from South Asia because this was a misnomer. But why does Vine Deloria get to do that outside of irony? All right, yeah. Huh? I think a sort of appropriation, right? If you're going to call us that, then we're going to do it. And we're going to use it to, sort of the, what was called the Red Power movement, right? And so, I mean, in the same way, I hesitate to do this, but in the same way, certain words are appropriate. Queer, for example, gets appropriated because it was once this derogatory term, but is then appropriated as a term of, as for a political movement. All right. So wait a second, where are we? The top-down approach. What should we do instead? I think Hernandez here does a very good job of advocating for a bottom-up approach, which is something we can all do. She also talks about CBPR, which is community-based participatory research, in which you first look for your research questions and your ideas from the community. And this is not something that this is something that people do in many different places. This is actually a health fields approach, but it can be done in anthropology or education. And so it's something that you're trying to look first for your research questions and your research design from the community. And then she gives us 6 different ways to modify it from page 88 to 90, which are good to look over if you're a CBPR person. She then discusses the idea of ecological noble savage. Now, what's interesting here is that most of the time, the first European ideas about the people who lived in the Americas had more to do with the evil savage, bad, right? But the flip side of that is a kind of romanticized stereotype, which is the idea that all indigenous people live with nature, cry every time a piece of garbage is on the ground, and are all completely in tune, sort of innocent children of the forest types. So what's the problem? What's the problem with an ecological noble savage stereotype? Yeah, John.
Like Hernandez mentioned in the beginning of the first 2 chapters, there's natives already living in cities that were once considered native land, so that automatically doesn't. If we were to put the old stereotype of the noble savage, that's just not. It's just invalid.
All right, so absolutely. And on the one hand, here's Hernandez living in Seattle, grew up in Los Angeles, 70% of Native Americans live in urban settings. So if you're going to say that nobody can be an indigenous unless they conform to the noble savage, you're basically locking people out of an identity. And, that's, yeah, definitely. What else? If I look over the Americas and I say, aha, all indigenous people are in harmony with their environment, what am I doing? Yeah, Cass. Yeah, exactly. Hernandez calls this pan-indigeneity, broad generalized indigeneity, which in some ways can be useful, I think. Sometimes people like to draw alliances among different groups, and Hernandez herself might be trying to make alliances, but that doesn't mean everybody's the same in those groups. And that's the problem with this stereotype, is it makes everybody seem the same, and it locks people into a role of being in the past. As John has said, people are not in the past. They change even in their own environments. They are changing. They are not locked in some sort of traditional role. They may have, they are definitely able to change, adapt, and not simply locked into this one perspective. The other thing she talks about, which I want to talk about a little bit, because she says that the ecological noble savage stereotype justified our genocide, which is kind of, it wouldn't seem like it would work. But basically, what she's saying is that under the European idea, they said, well, they're just these innocent, children of the forest or nature. And they then were able to claim that, well, they're not working the land. They're not improving the land. They're not farming the land. And so the idea was that since they're being inefficient, they're not farming, they're just taking nature, it justified people removing them from the land and farming it instead. And I want to dwell on this a little bit because oddly enough, this idea of, what they call the labor theory of property comes up from time to time, even in today's world. So there's a lot of text. Don't copy it down. Just scan it. So this was last year in 2022. So I don't know if you know, in some events and even at Hartwick College, like Jaeger Museum events, people will give land acknowledgements. So they'll acknowledge the land that people are on. And so the University of Washington recommended that professors, give a land acknowledgement in their syllabus to the Coast Salish people, which Hernandez is also acknowledging and lives upon. So this this computer science professor says, okay, I'll give you a land acknowledgement. Now he doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to put this on his syllabus. It's not required, it's just recommended. And so he puts on his syllabus, I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, the Coast Salish people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land currently occupied by the University of Washington. Yikes, exactly. Thank you. I wanted to say yikes, but yeah, you should recognize this as yikes, right? Because it's the idea that they're not working the land. There's actually an idea that goes back to the philosopher John Locke. And so it's the idea that the people who work the land should have ownership over the land. And so he's saying the labor theory of property, don't owe them anything. I can be on this land. I'm a professor. Not the best. Yikes. The truth of the matter is, Indigenous peoples were working the land and they were managing the land in various ways, in ways that we'll probably never understand because people were displaced. So moving on to next chapter. Some we got there, right? They were doing cool things like building pyramids, cities, things that we can't even figure out how they did them. Right, Mickey? Can we figure out all that Inca architecture? No. Whoa. Just like Hernandez says, can't even figure it out through physics. They don't know how. I think Hernandez was mostly talking about the pyramids in the Maya area, but yeah, people were building pyramids, cities. They had these codices, written documents and hieroglyphics. In the Andes, they also had things called the threaded string knots, which were used to do accounting. What happened to these, John?
All got taken by historical anthropology.
No, there were no anthropologists at the
back
time,
then, well,
but whatever. Well, yeah, same type of people. Look at that beautiful codex. A lot of this stuff was destroyed. A lot of it they just burned. Some of it got put in museums, as she says. Where do you have to go to see this?
city.
In a city. This one's in Vienna. It came to Europe in 1519, apparently. And then it went to various cities. She calls it a peripatetic. And went to museum to museum. If you want to see it now, you have to go to Vienna, Austria. Anybody ever been to Vienna? Not even we can get to Vienna. Yeah, so how are you going to get there from the Zapotec region? Very difficult. So a lot of this knowledge was destroyed. The quipus, the Incas had these quipu threads, which are in some ways a form of accounting or writing in 3 dimensions of knotted string. But a lot of that got burned. She makes the point that a lot of the brunt of this actually happened in the Caribbean. That was the first place that Columbus landed and really bore the brunt of this first colonization. However, she says that we have to be careful of the idea. There's oftentimes they use the word extinct, that the people of Puerto Rico or the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands went extinct. And as she says, don't use the word extinct because that would imply that they are an entirely different species of human beings. So no humans can go extinct unless we all go extinct because we're one big species. And as some people have put it, there's probably a lot more that has survived than is often said to be the case. She's an example of that. Although, I mean, certainly, I think what she's talking about, though, specifically is that in the larger populated centers, like the former Inca Empire, the former Aztec Empire, it was more obvious that people were still there. The islands of the Caribbean, because the onslaught was so tremendous, and because it was relatively low populated, because they were almost always converted to large-scale plantation agriculture, the population decline was very, very dramatic. And so people have argued that it doesn't exist at all. Whereas it would be much harder, it would be impossible to argue that, say, in the Maya lands or in the Amazon or the centers of indigenous population. She also gives us the example of permaculture. And, this is one of those things that people, anybody heard of permaculture? Yeah, I was looking it up. And what she's talking about with permaculture is, it was established by Bill Mollison, a pioneer. This is on page 108. It was observed nature cycles and movements to recreate an ecosystem. But as she says, he got this from the Aboriginal peoples of Tasmania off the coast of Australia. I looked this up on Wikipedia, and sure enough, it's true. But if you look on the permaculture website, it's like they again vanish. And it's all these guys and doing their permaculture thing. And so her point is you should at least credit the indigenous people. And I think, to me, this is especially the island of Tasmania which again got named for some guy named Tasman, some European Dutch explorer or something. The island of Tasmania was one of those places that it endured, again, one of the worst massacres of people in the colonial period, and a place where it was said the indigenous people, that in the Aboriginal Tasmanians, had gone extinct. And that was not true, but it was pretty bad. And in anthropology, they're known for having one of the world's simplest toolkits. So, some people had speculated they didn't even have fire. And so it's to me, it's sort of extreme, ironic, I don't know what to call it, that somebody would go there and try and find this kind of natural system and then bring it back and try to teach people about it without more acknowledging how much the Tasmanian Aboriginal practices were important for their studies. So, just a little example of this. She does cite Dr. Enrique Salmón out of the American Indian Studies program for his idea of kincentric ecology. Again, this idea that things other than humans are alive in the natural world, and we can have kinship-like relations with them, reciprocity with plants and non-human animals. And it's, again, it may sound strange, but it's pretty central to this kind of idea of taking care of or healing in indigenous environments. And she uses it to say that it's at the basis of what she calls indigenous holistic thinking, which is basically that you see that everything is interconnected. Kincentric ecology, you say from the whole. Now, apparently when she talked about this, one of her professors said, hey, that's just systems thinking. Systems thinking. And she says, no, it's not. It's not systems thinking. It's different from you Westerners and your systems thinking. Anybody catch what the difference is between systems thinking and indigenous holistic thinking? Yeah, Cass. Yeah, no, I think that sums it up very nicely. So in the holistic thinking, you kind of take the whole and you look at it as a whole from the beginning as interconnected. Systems thinking, and I think she's pretty much right on this. In Western science, we like to break things down into all these parts, break them into areas, and then all of a sudden you need interdisciplinary thinking to bring it all back together, right? And so it's like, we spend half the time breaking you all into disciplines, and then you're like, oh, wait, let's do some interdisciplinary, do environmental studies, and we'll bring it all back together, right? Instead of just starting from the whole, from the beginning. I mean, how long did it take us to get an environmental studies program at Hartwick? Many, many, many years. Y'all are just, I know it seems ancient to you, but this was a long fight. Bring these things back together, get some systems thinking here, right? But yeah, I think she's correct that, the idea that you're bringing broken pieces back, bringing pieces back together is not the same as sort of looking at it as from the beginning as a whole.